everybody, I'm Scott Allen Miller. Today on Sam IT, we're going to take a step back in history and we're going to look at what were green screen terminals. Now, some of you who are old like me, sorry if that makes you feel old that you're like me, but you may remember a time when we used what we called green screen terminals for everything. And for those of you who are younger, I'm sure you have seen at least old movies or videos or whatever, or heard us old-timers talking about how we used to have terminals everywhere. And even the term terminal had to come from somewhere, right? So what were these things? So the way that we worked originally, right, computers used to only have, like, you'll see them in the 1960s movies, right, a big wall of blinking lights and big buttons that people pushed, and that was it. There was no keyboard or mouse or anything like that. You pushed some buttons and a bit of tape came out from somewhere and gave you the answer, right? 100 people would sit there pressing buttons, and then after days and days of computation, right, a piece of paper would pop out and say 42, and that was it. That's all it knew, right? That's all they could do. But then eventually they said, well, there's got to be better ways to communicate with the computer as computers became more powerful. And they started taking old telegraph equipment called teletypes, or TTYs. And they would plug these in, and you would basically have a typewriter that was electrified, and when you hit the keys, it would send the signal of the key to the computer. And the computer would then, at some point, send a signal back to a printer, literal printer, that would print out either the key you just hit, or the response that the computer had to you, whatever. I mean, it was programmatic. So we called these TTYs, and they were actual typewriter, mechanical typewriter keyboards that then had they were hitting buttons to send an electrical signal, and then an actual printer with actual paper and ink would print out any response from the computer. It was kind of obnoxious to use. But we then moved on pretty quickly to what basically were modern keyboards that were directly attached to a old CRT monitor, and that CRT basically showed the same thing that would have been on the paper with the older literal TTYs. The connection between the keyboard and the monitor and the computer was the same as it had been with the old printer and keyboard. It used the same communication protocol, it used the same actual cable and physical, interface ends on the cable and everything. And so we continued to think of these as TTYs, just electronic ones. In those early days, they had to keep the cost down and they had to be easy on your eyes, and so the only technology we had at the time was CRTs, the cathode ray tubes, right, the big heavy. Today, even those are archaic, but back then we didn't have LCD screens. There were no flat panels. Everything was a CRT, so that was just normal. But they didn't put them in color because it was only able to show text on the screen. It had been black and white on paper anyway. So to make it easy on the eyes and low cost to make the equipment and to use less power, green worked out really well, and so most of these screens were just black and green. That's all there was. If you had actually used thick colors like white, it would have been probably too bright and harsh, or the contrast would have been too much. Green actually worked really well. And if you're like me, I actually long for those old days. I love the glow of those screens. I love how it looked and felt, and it actually was pretty pleasant to work on for long periods of time. Now, other types did appear over time. IBM specifically experimented with more of a turquoise color. A lot of makers went to an amber color, which was a little bit more harsh, but it was a little bit more visible too. I still prefer the green more than anything, but all of them have a certain nostalgic feel for those of us who worked with it. And I even miss the old clacking of the older keyboards, like just the sound and the look. It was wonderful. And we didn't have mice, of course. It was still just text input and text coming back on the screen. Now, how did those actually connect? Well, if you're familiar today with more or less traditional serial cables, we still have, even though it's not super common today, RS-232 serial communications. That's the generally 9-pin connector that some computers still have. You can do things with those, especially for industrial equipment. They're still in common use. I know personally, I tend to use them with industrial scales. It's just a place where there's no need for a newer technology. These days, most computers don't have the serial connector anymore, and so they use like a USB adapter or something, but the technology is still out there. Well, in the old days, we used things just like RS-232, basic serial communication, and in some cases it was actually RS-232. And because there was no networks, this is important to remember, this is a pre-network technology, so these terminals could not be networked. They weren't computers. They are literally just a screen that's showing something that could have gone to a printer and a keyboard. So this connection was just a serial connector, not a network connector, that went directly to the computer. Now, serial cables can actually go pretty far. They're not limited to just a few feet like we often assume that they are. The signaling on them is pretty basic and very slow, so it survives over a long way pretty well. It was common to have a server in one room and then have other rooms where terminals would be literally cabled to the computer. Now, to make the computers able to handle more than a single terminal, a lot of those serial communications channels can actually be aggregated through multiplexers and octopus cables and things, so that the original computer may have had only one or two or a handful of serial connectors, often more than one, and could be connected out to boxes and splitters that could hook up literally hundreds or maybe even thousands of green screen terminals to that single computer. Still, no network. Every one of these machines was still directly connected to the computer. These are multiplexers, not switches or hubs. There's no bus technology here. It's actually everyone is connected in through a direct serial channel. So in this way, there was no networking, but you had lots and lots of potential users using the computer at the same time. And this is where a lot of our concepts of things like thin computing and terminals and even how modern things like SSH are operating, is that they're still emulating some pieces of this under the hood. And it's still a very functional way to work, and even modern computers can be used in this way. If you want to do a interesting project and do something to recreate how this was done, you could, for example, go out and get a motherboard, and it doesn't have to be a high-end one, just anything that has a serial connector on it or could adapt to a serial connector. And this could be like a high-end desktop, it could be an actual server. You could do this potentially with a Raspberry Pi as long as you can get a serial connector on it. And then you could get one or more terminals. You could either find old ones and buy them, but most of those CRTs have not lasted all that well. Or you could go out and build your own, again, using similar things like Raspberry Pis or other low-powered boards or full-power desktops, just as long as it has some way to get to a serial connector, and then making the local screen use something like PuTTY or some other kind of session, and then simply make it full screen so that there's no visible windows of any type, and have that connect automatically through the serial to the server, which may just be a Raspberry Pi, and load something like Linux on there and set it to send the TTY through the serial connector. All this takes a little bit of work, but this is all stuff you can easily do in a weekend as a project at home for fun, and you could build what is essentially a modern take on the old serial connection green screens. Of course, you'd be using LCDs, you'd be using more modern connectors, you'd be using more modern technology under the hood, but you'd still be using serial connectors and replicating all the functionality of how it used to be. This would be awkward and doesn't serve a lot of purpose, except it's very educational and could be fun, just if you've never used the old systems, to experience how it could work today. And if you could find some kind of splitter for that serial connector, you could do this with several and hook up a little lab and run it just like you would have used a computer lab in the 1980s or early 1990s. Somewhere around 1993 to 1995, people started moving away from this. So if you didn't do multi-user computing in a moderate-sized environment prior to about that year, you easily have never seen this. But if by about 1994 you had ever done that, you almost couldn't avoid it. It was so ubiquitous. I hope that explains a little bit of IT history, where some of our trends and terms and thoughts come from, where things like, why is there a TTY in my Linux system? That's why it is, because it's still named after that original thing. It still works that way under the hood. It literally, these systems were built during a time where that's still the case. Linux comes from 1991. When it was first created, TTY connected to green screen terminals was still the original expectation for a lot of its use. They knew that those things would be changing at that point, but it was the current use case that people were thinking of when those systems were created. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe. I want to know about your memories of working on green screen or similar terminals. Put that below. If you've never seen one, ask away about your questions. You can ask all kinds of, there's all kinds of things you may not realize, like you could be logged into multiple ones. I used to, sit in a lab and move 3 of these green screens next to each other, so I would have 3 screens across. Even back in this era, I had to use 3 keyboards instead of 1, but the idea of having multiple screens and doing multiple tasks separated by actual windows, literally the piece of glass was a separate piece of glass, that was highly functional and very usable. I did that all the time. I didn't have a mouse, but I did have the ability to have 3 screens at once, and it was a common way to work very effectively. And that's something that people generally would never think of, and they never show in movies that people would do that, because it looks weird having those pushed together, but it was a thing you would do. And as always, you can sponsor us on Patreon to help us continue to bring you these educational videos. Talkadillo is a cloud-hosted or fully managed on-premises IP PBX platform providing businesses with simple and simply affordable voice communications. Visit Talkadillo.com and learn more about how Talkadillo can change how you view your telephones and help to support Sam IT.